Lord of Mysteries. My Identities echoes across time chapter 401 to 410. It was a pity that Mr. Fool was clearly a true god. Even though Derek revealed only a few words, Colin could guess that Mr. Fool, who had just returned from ancient times, had probably not yet fully recovered his original abilities or was under some sort of restriction. However, with multiple angels serving him, he didn't seem to lack anything. What he could think of, the most valuable thing that Silver City could offer to Mr. Fool, was either their faith or Silver City itself. But, unfortunately, that was the one thing they couldn't give away so easily. At least, not until it was confirmed that Mr. Fool was truly a god worth worshipping and capable of leading Silver City into the light. Colin could not simply trade away the fate of the entire city. He could personally become a follower of the Fool, but he couldn't easily entrust the entire city's destiny to him. Fortunately, he breathed a slight sigh of relief when he found, through his conversations with Derek, that although Mr. Fool might not lack anything, his followers seemed to have various needs. This presented some opportunities for Silver City. Making friends with Mr. Fool's followers might not be as good as directly trading with Mr. Fool, but it was better than nothing. Moreover, by interpreting the books brought by the Angel of Secrets over the past few days, he also discovered a fact. Outside the forsaken land of the gods, Beyonders seemed to have become a rare existence known only to a few. Monsters and extraordinary creatures also appeared to have become rare. However, the forsaken land of the gods did not lack these. Although the types of monsters were not comprehensive, compared to the outside world where extraordinary creatures had almost disappeared, the area around Silver City could be considered advantageous. Any patrol team could bring back plenty of prey, including spiritual materials or Beyonder characteristics. This was a tragedy, but for the average Silver City citizen, it was also an advantage. Having keenly noticed this, he had already begun deliberately sending people to collect these resources. Silver City had always gathered such resources, but only enough to meet their own needs. Now, however, he was preparing for the potential future sacrifices to Mr. Fool in life after leaving the forsaken land of the gods. He believed that Mr. Fool didn't lack followers, but he also understood that as a god who had returned from ancient times, Mr. Fool might not lack followers like angels or demigods, but he might not have many mid to low-level beyonders. And it was evident that Mr. Fool was not content to remain a hidden deity. His series of actions since returning made it clear that he intended to establish his own church and compete for followers with the seven gods, which meant he needed a large number of Beyonder characteristics to bestow upon his followers. This was where Silver City had an advantage. Of course, Colin also knew that the simplest and most straightforward way might be to develop the entire Silver City into followers of Mr. Fool. This was probably the reason why Mr. Fool valued Silver City so much. The number of Beyonders among the residents of Silver City was not small, and even ordinary people, due to the influence of their parents' or ancestors' Beyonder characteristics, were tall and robust. Living in a dangerous environment meant everyone had some combat capability, making them excellent candidates for church members. Although he believed that given enough time, Mr. Fool and his followers' abilities, as they were, after all, a true god and 8 angels, would be enough to gradually develop a church, he also understood that since Silver City had ready-made, high-quality believers, why not take advantage of it? He understood this logic, which both worried and reassured him. He worried because he still couldn't confirm Mr. Fool's nature. If the other party was an evil god disguised as benevolent, then Silver City might eventually fall into his clutches. He was reassured because, after understanding Silver City's value to Mr. Fool, he could at least comfort himself that if Silver City was indeed a crucial part of Mr. Fool's plan to establish a righteous church, then Mr. Fool probably wouldn't harm them. Instead, he might even take them out of the forsaken land of the gods. At the same time, Colin couldn't help but marvel at Mr. Fool. As expected of a true god, even in matters of establishing a church and gathering followers, his schemes were beyond imagination. Even the orthodox gods of the outside world probably wouldn't have expected Mr. Fool, a deity who had returned from ancient times, to suddenly gain tens of thousands of followers, including many Beyonders. This almost immediately solved the initial challenges that most secret organizations face when transitioning into a formal church, a lack of followers and the shortage of mid to low-level beyonders is the backbone. Given Mr. Fool's and his followers' strength, if he could pull a few allies among the seven gods, Colin could hardly imagine who could stop Mr. Fool from becoming the next righteous god of the new era. This was the scheme of a deity. Even after slumbering for many years, he could still control everything so quickly upon his return. As the chief of Silver City, Colin was indeed very perceptive. Relying on mere scraps of information, he deduced many things and was skilled at filling in the gaps. But no matter what, this didn't stop him from quietly preparing various Beyonder characteristics and spiritual materials. Even if these materials were not ultimately sacrificed to Mr. Fool, they would certainly be useful if Silver City managed to reach the outside world. Colin understood the concept of currency. Although Silver City did not have much use for money and most transactions were based on bartering, he knew the value of currency and money. Especially after reading the books from the outside world, he understood that to live in the current world, apart from land, money seemed to be an essential thing. Silver City naturally didn't have outside currency, but that didn't matter. Since Beyonder characteristics and spiritual materials were scarce in the outside world but Beyonders still existed, they could trade these items with the outside Beyonders for the currency they needed after reaching the outside world. Feeding tens of thousands of people wasn't a small matter. Even though Silver City had accumulated many Beyonder characteristics over the years, he still felt it wasn't enough and wanted to be more prudent. While Colin was busy with these matters, time quietly passed by. A week later, at 16 Minsk Street in Backland, the invisible barrier finally vanished. Lynn, who had slept for an entire week, finally opened his eyes. Still a bit groggy, he looked around. As his consciousness gradually cleared, he realized something. Damn, I've slept for a whole week. End of chapter. Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. Lynn has been missing for a week. Klein sighed at the thought. He had just left Quelaag Club and was on his way back to the Sherlock Detective Agency. He first noticed Lynn's disappearance on the second night after it happened. Although Klein and Lynn were quite familiar with each other, often visiting each other's homes, they each had their own lives. He usually had various commissions to handle, while Lynn was often out of sight, attending to his own matters. It wasn't unusual for them to go a whole day without seeing each other, which is why he didn't realize his friend was missing right away. It wasn't until the second night when he planned to visit Mr. Dorr in a dream for a lesson that he noticed the dream space was not accessible. This naturally made him think of the events that occurred after the Tarot Club meeting. Concerned that the Angel of Secrets might be in trouble, he decided to find Lynn to ask about the situation, only to discover that Lynn was also missing. But there were no signs of a struggle inside the house at 16 Minsk Street, and he confirmed through Beyonder means that no strangers had entered. This indicated that Lynn hadn't been kidnapped. Considering the last time he saw Lynn and the issues with the Angel of Secrets, he quickly concluded that Lynn's disappearance might be related to the unexpected event above the Saphira Castle. Although Lynn had said he was fine at the time, the current situation suggested otherwise. Naturally, Klein was worried. Unfortunately, neither divination nor other Beyonder means could locate Lynn. He even consulted Mr. Dorr, who also had no idea where Lynn had gone. The only certainty was that Lynn was still alive. This was Mr. Dorr's conclusion. Apparently, he had something left by Lynn, which allowed him to confirm Lynn's safety, but he couldn't pinpoint his location. With no other choice, he could only suppress his worry, keeping an eye on the situation at 16 Minsk Street while covering up Lynn and the Angel of Secrets' disappearance, like informing Miss Justice that the Pope was temporarily caught up in an unexpected situation, so their previous deal would be delayed, or reassuring the people of Silver City by telling them the Angel of Secrets was just dealing with something important and that they should be patient. Apart from this, his week was rather eventful. He followed reporter Mike to the East Borough again and got involved in a case of missing girls. He traced the source and uncovered the culprit behind multiple missing girls in the East Borough, a human trafficker named Capum, who seemed to have connections with the Augustus royal family and might have been acting under their orders. Naturally, he couldn't just let this go. Although he couldn't do anything about the Augustus royal family for now, he used the card of blasphemy belonging to the Red Priest and his divine gear to kill Capum and the Beyonders protecting him, rescuing dozens of kidnapped girls. This earned him the nickname, Red Knight. Thanks to this incident, Klein's progress in digesting the magician potion advanced significantly, putting him on the verge of complete digestion. Following the Capum case, he noticed that his friend Dr. Aaron from the Quelaag Club seemed to have unusually bad luck lately, which appeared to be connected to a boy named Will. Klein. Will. Which Will? Could it be the Angel of Mercury from The Fool's Bible? Unlike in the original story, where he didn't have much information, now that he had been thoroughly briefed by the Angel of Secrets, he knew that he would have an ally named Will, the Angel of Mercury, in the future. Without hesitation, Klein accepted Dr. Aaron's commission and followed him to investigate Will, discovering that the boy, who was theoretically alive just a month or two ago, was now just a skeleton. The trail seemed to end there, but the next day, Dr. Aaron came to him again, telling him about a nightmare he had involving Will and the Snake of Mercury. Klein took this seriously, but instead of acting recklessly, he first contacted Mr. Dorr from the Saphira Castle, asking him about Will. After confirming that Will likely bore him no ill will, he explored Dr. Aaron's dream and successfully met the future Angel of Mercury. Unlike in the original story, where Will only hinted at him and then left, this time, perhaps because of some clues he had received from Lynn, Will chose to meet and converse with Klein directly in the dream. With both sides holding goodwill towards each other, the conversation was naturally pleasant. Although they didn't delve into deep topics, Klein and the Angel of Mercury established a preliminary friendship. By the way, a large part of their bonding came from complaining about the Angel of Secrets. It wasn't about badmouthing someone behind their back, but both were victims of the Angel of Secrets, giving them a lot of common ground. However, Klein kept his guard up and didn't mention Lynn's disappearance, only saying that Lynn had left Backland temporarily. After all, both from Lynn's diary and what he learned from Mr. Dorr, Will, the Snake of Mercury, didn't seem particularly friendly with Lynn. Will was slightly disappointed that he didn't get to meet Lynn's human side, as he had apparently been observing for some time and noticed that Lynn seemed to have split into two entities, though he didn't fully understand the details. Will also openly expressed his desire to invest in Klein, saying that Klein's fate was extraordinary, clearly someone with great fortune. Since the Angel of Secrets was investing in him, Will felt he needed to get in on the action quickly before Lynn's companion, that dumb snake, took the opportunity. Klein didn't agree right away, as he wasn't lacking in high-sequence investors at the moment. Although the Angel of Secrets prophecy indicated that Will was his destined ally, Klein felt it was necessary to observe him further, at least to confirm what kind of person Will truly was. Will wasn't offended by this. In fact, he was very understanding, suggesting that they could collaborate on a small scale first before discussing a deeper partnership. Klein agreed to this. Aside from these two major events, the Tarot Club also held a regular meeting during the week of Lynn's disappearance. But with Mr. Fool covering for him, the other members simply thought that the Pope was busy with something and had taken a leave of absence. End of chapter. Besides the usual happenings, there was another matter this week that concerned Klein. He had heard a love story from another friend at the Quelaag Club, a story about a nobleman falling in love with a common girl. The story itself wasn't particularly special, and under normal circumstances, Klein might have just listened to it as gossip. However, because of certain warnings he'd received before, and the various significant events he had experienced shortly after his transmigration, he instinctively paid more attention to this story, wondering if it was tied to something more significant. His experiences in recent days had already been quite overwhelming. Unfortunately, despite Talam's gossipy nature, his mouth was unexpectedly tight-lipped. He couldn't get any other clues from him. Sighing inwardly, he finally returned to 15 Minsk Street. Almost instinctively, he glanced at the house next door, number 16, and noticed that the lights were on. Lynn is back. Klein's eyes widened slightly. He quickly moved to the door of 16 Minsk Street, and after knocking a few times, the door soon opened, revealing a familiar figure. Yo, Sherlock, good evening. Standing at the door was a young man with pale gray eyes and golden curls. His face, which could be described as the ugliest thing crafted by the creator, bore a familiar smile that was bright and somewhat foolish. It seemed he had just taken a bath, as there were still drops of water on his hair, and he appeared a bit relaxed, but there was nothing wrong with his aura. Phew. Good evening, Lynn. Klein almost instinctively exhaled and visibly relaxed. Even though Bethel had assured Klein that Lynn was in no danger, Lynn's sudden disappearance had still left a heavy weight in his heart. The situation that day in the Saphira castle had been quite terrifying, and Lynn's subsequent disappearance had only heightened his alarm. But now, it seemed everything was fine. What's with that expression? Although I did sleep for a week, which might have been a bit alarming, you don't need to look like a college student who thought they were abducted but then safely returned home, Lynn teased before stepping aside to invite him in. Come in, don't just stand at the door. I happen to make dinner. Would you like to join? I won't be polite then. Klein instinctively remembered the meals Lynn had cooked before, and his stomach began to anticipate the upcoming dinner. However, he didn't overlook the key point in Lynn's earlier statement, asking as he entered, slept for a week. Yeah, you came to my place, didn't you? Didn't you notice I was just sleeping in the bedroom? Lynn casually replied as he dried his hair with a towel. He could tell his room had been checked by someone during his sleep. You mean you spent a whole week sleeping in your bedroom? Klein frowned slightly, shaking his head. But I checked your bedroom and didn't see you. Ah. Lynn was stunned for a moment, not expecting that answer. After thinking for a few seconds, he seemed to realize something and said, then it's probably because we weren't in the same space. Klein's thoughts started to churn. Lynn didn't elaborate further. After using some small tricks to quickly dry his hair, he invited Klein to sit at the coffee table, setting out the dishes. Do you have any questions? What happened to you this time? Klein naturally grabbed the bowl and chopsticks, served himself some rice, and sat on the sofa. He didn't start eating immediately but asked, didn't you say nothing was wrong? How did you end up sleeping for a week? Well, nothing was wrong at first, but then something unexpected happened. Lynn answered casually while picking at his food. Mainly, that guy found some filthy stuff, and took advantage of the special situation to deal with it. As a result, I ended up sleeping for a week. Lynn was telling the truth since it was indeed his divine avatar that dealt with the black fangirl. Filthy stuff. Klein was clearly curious about what kind of being Lynn would refer to as filthy, and judging by his tone, it seemed he really disliked the entity. That's not important. Lynn shook his head, brushing off the topic, and then smiled, but thanks to that guy's actions, I also gained some extra benefits this time. Klein immediately looked at him curiously. You know that an angel of secrets can communicate with different versions of themselves across time. Lynn said while eating a piece of fish. Now, I've got a similar ability, even better. Lynn then briefly introduced Klein to his time-traveling ability. Yes, in Lynn's new script, the time-traveling ability was assigned to his main persona, mainly to facilitate following Klein and the others to the pre-epic. As for whether Klein had already figured out the truth about Lynn's two personas, it didn't matter, so long as that last layer of the veil wasn't torn apart, no one would be embarrassed, and everyone could look forward to a bright future. The more Klein listened, the wider his eyes grew. He truly hadn't expected that his somewhat foolish friend would suddenly gain a time-traveling ability after a week of disappearance and sleep. Although, considering that an angel of secrets could exist in multiple timelines and communicate with their different selves, this wasn't exactly surprising. Still, it was far more exciting for Klein than knowing that Lynn could exist in multiple timelines. Because Lynn's time travel ability could bring others along, which undoubtedly meant. Klein's grip on his chopsticks tightened as the thought crossed his mind. Seeing Klein's reaction, Lynn sighed and suddenly asked, you already know the truth about this place, don't you? Klein froze for a moment, suddenly becoming quiet as he sat on the sofa, looking somewhat melancholic and sad. I've indeed guessed it. Klein sighed, placing his bowl and chopsticks down. He looked at Lynn and said softly. This place is Earth, isn't it? Time seemed to freeze at that moment. Lynn also put down his bowl and chopsticks, looked at Klein, and under his gaze, nodded. Yes, this place is Earth. This is home. You never left home. End of chapter. We have never left our planet. It was difficult to say exactly how Klein felt at that moment. Sadness. Melancholy. Or perhaps a sense of relief, like a second shoe finally dropping. He simply fell silent. After a few seconds, he let out a long sigh, leaning back slightly, as if feeling somewhat dejected. Although I had already guessed it, it's still a bit hard to accept. Klein finally spoke, his eyes lowered, his smile hard to decipher. Was it bitter or relieved? But one thing was certain. Compared to the nearly collapsing state he was in when he learned the truth in the original story, Klein was handling it much better now. He was still sad, still melancholy, but his emotions were far from collapsing. This wasn't surprising. In the original story, when Klein learned the truth, he was already disconnected from his family in Tingnan, Benson and Melissa, with no way to return home. Additionally, due to Ince Zangwill, he had lost his respected captain, Dunn Smith, and Miss Daly. His relationships with other friends had become somewhat distant due to his obsession with returning home, and he was still under Amon's control. With all these setbacks, it would have been surprising if Klein's emotions hadn't collapsed. But now, thanks to Lynn's interference, Klein had not lost contact with his brother and sister. The captain and Miss Daly were also alive and recently married. Moreover, Klein had gained Lynn, a close friend and fellow transmigrator. And the Angel of Secrets had even given Klein hope, promising that he could bring his family to this era. There was also a crucial point. Klein had actually prepared himself for something like this a long time ago. The Angel of Secrets had hinted at this many times, even though Klein had always avoided thinking about it. But deep down, he had already prepared himself to face some kind of truth. It was because of these many factors that Klein, while still feeling sad and melancholic about the truth of his transmigration, wasn't on the verge of collapse. Lynn, seeing Klein like this, also breathed a sigh of relief. He had chosen to tell Klein the truth at this moment for a reason. Unlike the original story, where the idea of returning home was used as a carrot to motivate Klein to work hard and ascend, Lynn's efforts and promises had already ensured that Klein would, after learning the truth, strive even harder to ascend, not to return home, but to ensure that he and his family could survive the apocalypse. Moreover, Lynn understood Klein's character. After learning the truth, Klein might feel sad, but he wouldn't really give up. On the contrary, after the initial shock, Klein would be able to open his heart to a better life, avoiding the loneliness he had in the original story, where he ascended to the position of Lord of Mysteries but was ultimately alone. That was too tragic. Of course, there was another important reason. Lynn had already gained the ability to travel through time and space. Although he couldn't currently use his alternate account to travel to the previous era and retrieve Klein's family, if Klein truly missed his family, Lynn could take him back to visit his parents once the coordinates of the previous era were deciphered in a few months. Lynn thought this and said it out loud. In the next moment, he solemnly patted Klein on the shoulder and said, technically, the phrase, "we never left our planet," should be followed by, "and we can never return, but you have a cheat friend like me. Once the coordinates of the pre-epic are deciphered in a few months, I'll take you to visit your parents. So, there's no need to be too sad. Just think of it as a working aboard. After all, even before transmigrating, a regular worker could only see their parents a few times a year, right?" Lynn ended with a doubtful tone, scratching his chin. Hearing Lynn's obvious attempt to comfort him, Klein felt both touched and amused. His melancholy and sadness dissipated as he looked at Lynn. First, he said sincerely, "Thank you, Lynn. No need to thank me. We're best friends, aren't we? It's just a small favor, no need to thank me." Lynn waved his hand dismissively, as if saying, "Since we're best friends, don't be so polite." Then, he flashed a mischievous smile and said, "But if you really want to thank me, how about letting me draw some interesting close-ups when you ascend to the stage of the fool and become a cat? Oh, and would you mind if I publish a cat version of the Bible?" Klein. I had become emotional too soon. As expected of you, Lynn. I mind, thank you. After a few seconds, Klein finally managed to say, "But, becoming a cat and modeling for you isn't out of the question." Then it's settled. Lynn immediately said, giving Klein no chance to take back his words. Then, as if he remembered something, he added, "By the way, the tour group might not be just you. I might bring Russell and the Evernight Goddess along too." The Evernight Goddess. Klein was stunned for a moment before realizing, the Evernight Goddess is also a transmigrator. If the memories I share with the Angel of Secrets are correct, yes. Lynn nodded, adding a bit of background to his persona. Shared memories. Klein had obviously noticed the key point. This was also a result of the recent accidental fusion. Lynn said, rubbing his temples. I can now share some memories with the Angel of Secrets. Otherwise, how could I have known this was Earth? Then, as if remembering something, he added, oh, and the Evernight goddess seems to have come down from the Saphira castle as well. Klein's expression showed both confusion and realization, indicating that he already had some guesses. Lynn didn't intend to hide much more at this point. After all, since he had already revealed the truth of the transmigration to Klein, there was no need to keep other things a secret. He continued, based on the memories I share with the Angel of Secrets, the Evernight goddess, Rissel, and you all seem to have been transmigrated because of that Saphira castle. Lynn spent a few seconds organizing his thoughts before explaining, I'm not entirely sure of the specifics, but it seems that humanity really did face an apocalypse back then. Civilization collapsed in an instant, and most people died in the apocalypse. You transmigrators were selected as a contingency by the god I won't mention, pulled onto the Saphira castle when the apocalypse hit, and then slept there until you were released. Hearing this truth, Klein's eyelashes trembled. Even though he had already guessed it, hearing the actual truth still made him feel sad. Incredibly sad. His family had apparently died in the apocalypse, while he had been unknowingly pulled onto the Saphira castle and slept until now. End of chapter. Don't look so sad. Didn't he promise you he'd bring your family back? Lynn, of course, could see what Klein was thinking. He couldn't help but wave a hand in front of Klein's face, half joking yet full of confidence. Although he has a rather nasty personality, he's reliable when it comes to getting things done. Since he promised to bring your family back, he will definitely keep his word. And besides, Lynn stroked his chin and said, don't forget, I can take you on time travels. Even though I can't bring your family directly from the past, as long as you work hard and eventually fully accumulate the Saphira castle, becoming its master, we can go back to the pre-epic together. Then, you can personally bring your family to the Saphira castle and reunite with them in this new era. Klein snapped back to reality, listening to Lynn's serious words. His mood lightened significantly, and he couldn't help but say, so, in the end, I still need to work hard to advance. Whether it was to fulfill the agreement with the Angel of Secrets, to one day bring his family back himself, or to prevent another apocalypse, Klein felt he needed to push himself to advance. Fortunately, my magician potion has almost been digested. As long as I gather all the materials for Faceless, I can immediately advance to sequence 6. Klein calculated his progress, feeling a strong sense of urgency, but also brimming with motivation. Then Klein remembered something, and he looked at Lynn. If that day really comes, I could also summon your family too in the Saphira castle. As he spoke, Klein suddenly stopped because he realized that Lynn had never mentioned his family. Apart from the family he had in the world after crossing over, Lynn had never mentioned his family from before, even when he talked about time traveling to meet his family from the past. Lynn always spoke about Klein's situation instead. This made Klein start to have some unsettling suspicions. Lynn, on the other hand, glanced at Klein at that moment. He could naturally tell what Mr. Fool was thinking, but he didn't rush to explain. Instead, he served himself a bowl of soup, took a sip, and then said, I don't have any family in the pre-epic. I'm not quite like a normal person. From the moment I became conscious, I lived in a laboratory, so I don't have any blood-related family. Laboratory. Klein was visibly shocked. He looked at Lynn with some concern, clearly wanting to ask but also afraid of touching on Lynn's scars. Don't be so careful. It's not a past I can't talk about. Lynn shook his head and smiled at Klein before continuing. I was born as an experiment, originally designated as number 0, so I never had a proper education because everything I learned was taught by the researchers. But they never abused me, or rather, they didn't dare to abuse me. No. 0. Klein mulled over this designation in his mind, suddenly realizing something. The name, Lynn, was just a homophone for 0. Asterisk. As for the rest, there's not much to say. I stayed in the lab until I was 18, and then due to some accident, I finally left the lab and started living a normal life outside. Lynn said this with a somewhat peculiar expression, hesitating for a few seconds before adding, well, I guess you could call it a normal life. Transmigrating to the Detective Conan world, joining the organization, and becoming an undercover agent probably counts as a normal life, right? Lynn thought uncertainly. He spoke lightly, but Klein couldn't help but imagine a lot. Mr. Fool could almost picture how someone like Lynn, who had lived in a laboratory before adulthood, would fare when he first left. Everything in the world might have been unfamiliar to him. Before leaving the lab, Lynn might not have even seen the real sky, let alone interacted with the variety of people in society. Klein even wondered if Lynn had the common sense of a normal person when he first left the lab. Lynn might have been deceived by others when he first started interacting with people, maybe even starved because he couldn't find work, or perhaps he met some kind people who helped him. After going through many hardships, he gradually adapted to life outside and became the Lynn he is today. Thinking of this, Klein looked at Lynn with eyes full of sympathy, like he was looking at a pitiful child of the new century. Lynn, noticing Klein's thoughts, slowly raised an eyebrow. He recalled his life right after crossing over to the Detective Conan world, first discovering he was a member of the Black Organization, then bumping into Jin, tricking Vermouth, taking advantage of his foreknowledge and status as a minor to mess with Bourbon, securing a long-term benefactor, and using the chaos of the Conan world to rack up achievements and secure a codename. All the while, he embezzled a lot of money from the organization. Was it really pitiful? Lynn, who had thrived in the organization, couldn't help but reflect. He then nodded. Yes, it was indeed pitiful. After all, he had just emptied out the organization, destroyed its remnants with the help of the official authorities, and before he could establish his new organization, he crossed over to this world. So pitiful. Thinking of the money he didn't have time to spend and the employees he didn't get to overwork, Lynn was filled with heartache. As for Mr. Fool's imagined scenarios of missing common sense, being deceived, it was laughable, completely non-existent. Lynn was a natural trickster. Even if his mind was empty, he could deceive others purely by instinct. Back in the lab, the psychologists who treated him were almost swayed by his reverse psychology. And the researchers who taught him didn't neglect common sense, they were just deliberately steering him toward being a good person. Asterisk. Moreover, aside from not being able to go outside, Lynn was perfectly capable of using the internet. However, thinking of his unknown true form and his unique identity, Lynn couldn't help but feel a bit confused. What was the situation with the lab he was in before crossing over? Did they know about his unique identity? And that man, the father. Thinking of it, there was a woman named Carter too, who raised him since childhood, almost like a mother. Lynn frowned, feeling instinctively that something was hidden in all of this. By the way, I slept for a week. Did you help cover for me with Miss Justice? Lynn, unable to figure things out after thinking for a while, decided not to dwell on the past. He suddenly remembered something and asked Klein. I told Miss Justice that you got caught up in some unexpected trouble, so you couldn't complete the transaction for the time being. Klein, already used to Lynn's erratic thoughts, nodded and said, now that you're back, it's best to communicate with Miss Justice as soon as possible. TN. In Chinese, the number 0 is pronounced as ling, ling. The pronunciation of Lin can resemble ling in Mandarin. TN. So he is basically Yogiri Takatu. Got it. End of chapter. Lin had a great week of sleep. Not only did the assimilated values from his latest surge decrease, but even the lingering minor aftereffects from previous power borrowings also disappeared entirely. However, this deep sleep brought some trouble for Lin. Not only did his fifth epic self urgently need to contact Miss Justice to discuss the debut of Aurora Order members, but his divine avatar also needed to rush to the forsaken land of the gods to calm down a certain almost irate, Little Red. At the same time, Lin had to deal with issues related to 2 other Smurf accounts. Damn, all my Smurf accounts fell asleep together. Fully refreshed, Lin bid farewell to Klein and began multitasking to manipulate the various Smurf accounts that had fallen into slumber along with his main consciousness. In the second epic, the Angel of Secrets, who had suddenly fallen asleep, shocking everyone, finally opened his eyes. Lin blinked, finding himself lying in a familiar room. It was clearly his bedroom. Not far away, a figure sat at a desk, meticulously handling a mountain of paperwork. Lin's first thought was that this person was his primary guardian, his father figure Sasrier. But then he noticed that the person's back was clad in a black divine robe, with hair that was mostly black with a hint of golden yellow near the roots. Lin was momentarily stunned before recognizing the figure. It was the ancient sun god. Why would the ancient sun god be handling paperwork? Was he hallucinating? Or had the ancient sun god finally grown a conscience? Lin couldn't help but feel that something was off after waking up. As Lin was questioning his reality, the ancient sun god, who seemed to have finished the paperwork, turned around. His golden eyes, like the sun, glanced at Lin, and he faintly smiled, saying, "Are you surprised to see me?" "A little." Lin nodded honestly, recalling the events in the second epic before his slumber. His expression turned slightly odd as he said, "I remember I had already set off with Sasrier and the others to the giant king's court, right? You suddenly fell unconscious on the way, and Sasrier decided that it was not suitable to bring an unconscious you to the giant king's court, so he sent you back. They were all very worried about you." The ancient sun god answered calmly. He seemed to assess Lin briefly before concluding, "But it seems that this sleep wasn't a bad thing for you." "It wasn't." Lin nodded but then asked, "How long was I asleep?" Given the different flow rates of time in each space, Lin wasn't sure how long he had slept in the second epic. 100 years. The ancient sun god calmly stated a number that Lin found incredibly outrageous. Damn. Lin couldn't help but curse. While he knew the time flow between the fifth and second epics was absurdly different, it had never been as crazy as 7 days in the fifth epic equating to 100 years in the second epic. Was it because I fell asleep? Lin was baffled, and then he seemed to remember something. He looked down at his body. Great, still the same 7 or 8-year-old child. Those 100 years were nothing. Okay, that's a surprising answer. So, does this mean that the giant king's court affair is long over? What's the current situation? Oh, how's the Eye of Secrets doing? After 100 years, how many of those kids I trained are still around? And why are you in my room? How are Little Red and the others doing? Lin's questions came one after another, truly experiencing what it meant to wake up to a world changed. The Giant King's court matter ended a long time ago. Our cooperation with the giants was fairly successful. We've now officially gone to war with the dragons and giants. The Elven King and the Phoenix have already fallen. The ancient sun god answered unhurriedly, as if he had anticipated Lin's questions, or perhaps he was just that familiar with these matters. The Eye of Secrets has developed quite well. Several members of your first batch of students have ascended to demi-godhood. They have followed your original plan, taught many students, and have been awaiting your awakening. Awaiting my awakening. Lin was a bit surprised. He wasn't shocked that some of his students reached demi-godhood. After all, he had carefully selected talents for the first batch of the Eye of Secrets. But he had only trained them for 3 years before inexplicably falling into a deep sleep for a century. Lin thought his students would have long forgotten him. You underestimate yourself. The ancient sun god glanced at Lin, speaking in a calm yet matter-of-fact tone. Even if you had slept for longer, they wouldn't forget you. After all, who would easily forget the person who pulled them out of the abyss? Especially Lin. The ancient sun god looked at the young angel. He was truly someone who was hard to forget after interacting with. Well, Lin felt a bit conflicted. Although I want to say, as expected of me, I also feel a bit guilty. It was rare for the ancient sun god to find this amusing, but that didn't stop him from continuing to answer. As for why I'm here, it's because I'm borrowing your aura to suppress the God Almighty's will. Huh. Lin was taken aback by this, and he couldn't help but look at the ancient sun god again. He asked, the God Almighty's will awakening within you doesn't surprise me, but using my aura to suppress it, is that even possible? Lin wasn't surprised by the God Almighty's will awakening within the ancient sun god. After all, as long as someone was an angel of his pathways, they would more or less have some form of revived God Almighty's will within them. It was just a matter of whether they could suppress it. If they could, everything would be fine. If they couldn't, the worst-case scenario would be someone like the out-of-control Antigonus or the ancient sun god, who had to die to escape the revival of the God Almighty's will. Although, at this stage, the God Almighty's will within the ancient sun god hadn't reached the point of losing control. As a being who was conservatively estimated to be a dual-pathway true god, the high proportion of the God Almighty's will's revival was normal for the ancient sun god. Lynn was just surprised that he could help suppress the God Almighty's will. Did he really have such a function? Normally, you wouldn't. The ancient sun god seemed to understand what Lynn was thinking and calmly responded, but during this sleep, your aura became very special. As long as you were within a certain range, no matter how active the God Almighty's will, or even the original creator's will within someone was, it would be directly suppressed, and they would remain calm for a long period. During this time, even their divinity and madness would be weakened. End of chapter. This. Lynn was momentarily stunned, then quickly realized what was happening. It seemed that his true self had somehow sent him a buff from afar, which the ancient sun god had piggybacked on. Wait a minute. Lynn suddenly realized something and looked at the ancient sun god, uncertainly saying, "You just said we're currently fighting against giants and dragons. The elf king and the phoenix ancestor have already fallen, and I've only been asleep for 100 years. Although there's the Sea of Chaos, and he's a dual-sequence true god who even shepherded the uniqueness of error. Just like how Artisan after just advancing to sequence 0 couldn't fully digest the potion and had insufficient anchor points, resulting in a subpar state that only allowed him to exhibit the power of a king of angels. Similarly, Klein, who just advanced to the Lord of Mysteries, could only be called a half-great old one due to resisting the will of the celestial. He even had to fall into slumber. Before Lynn fell asleep, the ancient sun god, despite theoretically having invincible combat strength, had to spend a lot of energy fighting against the resurgent God Almighty's will inside him due to the lack of followers and anchor points. As a result, the ancient sun god could not fully display his strength. However, in this situation, Lynn couldn't help but suspect that the ancient sun god was using him as a will stabilizer, allowing him to unleash his full strength freely, thus hastening the defeat of the ancient gods. It's not just me. Sorcerer and the others also use your strength to suppress the will and madness of the ancient gods. So, don't worry about missing the 100-Year War. In a way, your role while asleep might have been greater than if you were awake. The ancient sun god calmly nodded in response to Lynn's subtle gaze. The ancient sun god's words were quite sincere. In an era where high-end combat power had to divide their attention to fight against madness and the resurgence of the ancient gods, the role of a stabilizer that could suppress madness and the will of the great old ones was unimaginable. An example being that if Lynn had this stabilizer, Klein wouldn't have had to sleep at the end of the original story and could have directly unleashed the full power of the genuine Lord of Mysteries. Thus, the ancient sun god couldn't help but regretfully say, "It's a pity this discovery was made so late. Otherwise, I could have at least dealt with the dragons during this time." After saying that, he looked at Lynn as if regretting something. "Lynn, why? You want me to keep sleeping? But the buff from my true self is over. Even if I keep sleeping, it won't help." For a moment, Lynn didn't know how to respond, nor could he imagine the kind of inhumane observations he must have undergone during his slumber. After thinking for a while, he finally said, "So you've already accommodated the tyrant's uniqueness?" "Yes," the ancient sun god nodded reservedly. "All right." Lynn scratched his head, not wanting to dwell on it. Although the sequence of the ancient god's demise seemed off, history had clearly diverged from the original due to his interference, so he decided to take things one step at a time. Lynn suddenly remembered something and asked, "What about Medici? You still haven't told me what happened to him, and what about Sorcerer and the others?" Medici. The ancient sun god paused for a moment before turning his head to look at the door and said, "You can come with me to see him right now, it might surprise you." Raising an eyebrow at the remark, Lynn got out of bed and followed the ancient sun god outside. Only then did Lynn notice that while his sleeping chamber looked exactly as it did before, the environment outside had drastically changed. It had the impression of having evolved from a small town to a kingdom. Not far away, a young man with blood-red hair and eyes was walking towards them, stepping on the air. He was wearing black armor, splattered with blood in many places, and had a large creature slung over his shoulder, seemingly just returning from the battlefield. Lynn squinted to confirm that the creature was a golden dragon, likely a sequence 3 or 4 adult dragon, possibly even sequence 2. Ha! Sleeping Beauty finally deigns to open his eyes. Accompanied by a familiar, sarcastic tone, the dragon was casually thrown aside, landing with a heavy thud. The red-haired youth finally landed in front of Lynn, first bowing slightly to the ancient sun god before turning to Lynn, a mocking smile on his lips. My dear brother, did you have a pleasant sleep? Did your body rust? Lynn squinted at him, immediately understanding why Medici was acting so arrogant. He had become a Sequence 1 conqueror and had accommodated the Red Priest's uniqueness, qualifying as a king of angels. This wasn't surprising since the Red Priest's uniqueness was confirmed to be with the Elf King, and the ancient sun god had already dealt with the Elf King. It was extremely pleasant. Lynn smiled, stretching his body as he looked at Medici and said, as for whether my body rusted, why don't we spar a bit and find out? When your younger brother's wings get too hard, a good beating is all it takes. Lynn was in excellent condition after his sleep and didn't mind borrowing a bit of power from his true self to teach his bratty brother a lesson. If you want to fight, do it outside the city, otherwise, Sasrir will complain about the expenses again, the ancient sun god calmly reminded them as he observed the brotherly love on display. Okay. Lynn made a gesture to the ancient sun god and then grinned at his eager younger brother, saying, let's go, little red, show me how much you've improved in the 100 years I've been asleep, and don't cry when you lose. HMPH. Medici sneered, clearly confident in himself. So, later, at the banquet celebrating Lynn's awakening. Medici, what's with that bump on your head? Ouroboros curiously eyed the large bump on the war angel's head, looking like he wanted to poke it. Are you a cat? Medici swatted Ouroboros' hand away irritably, then glared at the star of the banquet, almost grinding his teeth. Can't beat him. Still can't beat him. Lynn, this damn cheat, just doesn't play fair. Hey, little red, does your head still hurt? A certain unscrupulous older brother, clearly aware of Medici's gaze, cheerfully greeted him. Crack. The cup in Medici's hand shattered as he gritted his teeth and obliterated the shards, glaring at Lynn, who was happily catching up with Sasrir. Finally, he sighed. At last, he woke up. This guy can really sleep. End of chapter. So, our next target is to take down the giant king, Ormir. At a banquet in the second epic, Lynn took a sip of grape juice, thoughtfully asking this question. By the way, Lynn had already grown into a young man at this point. For Lynn, who had mastered some of the Sage Pathway's abilities, changing his human form and growing up was not difficult. Previously, he had maintained a child's form only for ceremonial reasons. Now, 100 years had passed, and even Little Red had grown up, so Lynn naturally had to grow as well. Yes, that is indeed the plan, Sasrir nodded with a smile. Unlike Medici, who had undergone significant changes, the Dark Angel didn't look much different from when Lynn had fallen asleep. The only difference seemed to be that the dark circles under his eyes had faded a bit. Perhaps the ancient sun god had finally grown a conscience. Lynn thought uncertainly, casually remarking, I thought we would target the dragon first. The uniqueness of the White Tower and the Visionary should both be in Anquelt's hands, right? Now that I think about it, I do have a grudge against that dragon of nightmares. Lynn couldn't help but smile at this point. It really was a grudge. The dragon of nightmares, who was nominally the son of the dragon of imagination, Anquelt, but was actually a split off of his being, had died at Lynn's hands, and Lynn had even turned its characteristic into a quill for his daily psychological treatment. Sasrir evidently also thought of the dragon of nightmares that Lynn had made into a quill, and a subtle smile appeared on his face as he sipped his wine, hinting, others will think the same way, and as for Ormir, we've already made some arrangements. Lynn paused for a moment, then immediately understood. In simple terms, this was a strategy that exploited others' thought patterns. Although the gods might not be aware of the existence of the outer gods, they would still be drawn to devouring beings of similar sequences due to the laws of Beyonder characteristics, convergence to one another. This was demonstrated in the original work by the actions of the Elf King. Given this premise, just as Lynn instinctively believed that the ancient sun god's next target should be the dragon of imagination, Anquelt, others would naturally think the same. Thus, Anquelt would be more vigilant, guarding against an attack from the ancient sun god, while the giant king Ormir might be comparatively lax. This presented a perfect opportunity for the ancient sun god's camp. At the same time, Lynn could roughly guess what Saussure meant by arrangements. If taking down the dragon of imagination Ankwelt was purely the responsibility of the ancient sun god's camp, then dealing with the giant king Ormir clearly involved natural allies, such as the Evernight goddess and the blood ancestor Lilith, who is currently in a state of feigned death and would eventually take over the role of the goddess of harvest. These two also had cooperative relationships with the ancient sun god's camp and had always maintained good relations. In this matter, they naturally opposed the giant king Ormir and would undoubtedly contribute significantly once the ancient sun god initiated the attack. With this, their side would effectively have the combined combat power of a half-outer god and two sequence zero beyonders, making the task of killing the giant king Ormir much easier. Lynn also thought of the future god of combat, Badhael, the son of the giant king, who was known to have maintained good relations with the ancient sun god's camp during the collaboration between the giants and the ancient sun god's camp. Furthermore, Badhael was later confirmed to have joined the Rose Redemption in the original work. The most critical point was that Lynn had always been curious about where Badhael's god of combat uniqueness had come from. After all, the giant king Ormir was said to have died at the hands of the ancient sun god in the original story, so how could his son Badhael inherit his father's uniqueness and then join the Rose Redemption? The most likely scenario that Lynn could think of was that Badhael, this seemingly trustworthy, filial son, had played a major role in betraying his father. Considering the madness characteristic of the ancient gods, this was not surprising. While normal deities might have some familial warmth between them and their offspring, the ancient gods certainly did not. Many ancient gods had killed their own offspring without hesitation, so it was hard to say that the giant king Ormir was a good father. Even if the giant king Ormir was indeed a good father, it didn't necessarily mean he was a good father to Badhael. After all, the giant king Ormir didn't have just one child. It was mentioned in the original story that the giant king Ormir had another younger son named Bladel, who was also sequenced too. With both an elder son and a younger son, it was hard to tell which child was favored more. In such a situation, Badhael's decision to join forces with the ancient sun god to backstab his father made perfect sense. Especially since Lynn remembered that in the original story, it was mentioned that Badhael didn't seem to be very popular among the giants, his own people. Once the giant king Ormir was dead, the dragon of imagination, Ankwelt, would be isolated and would easily fall to the ancient sun god's camp. Especially considering that Ankwelt had a natural traitor by his side, the future god of knowledge and wisdom, currently the dragon of wisdom, Harabergen. Lynn didn't believe that Harabergen only defected to the ancient sun god after the death of the dragon of imagination, Ankwelt. Many beings had defected to the ancient sun god. Why else would Harabergen have become one of the 8 kings of angels? There must have been some contribution. Lynn even suspected that Harabergen had already secretly pledged loyalty to the ancient sun god and was merely lying low within the Dragon of Imagination's camp. While the Dragon of Imagination possessed the uniqueness of the visionary pathway, its insane state likely meant it couldn't fully utilize it, making it unclear whether it could detect that Harabergen was already preparing to betray. In that case, it does make sense to target the giants first. Lynn nodded, took another sip of grape juice, and then, as if remembering something, asked, "By the way, before I fell asleep, Sun God had us go to the giant king's court partly to search for the uniqueness of the hermit pathway, right? Did you manage to find it later?" Lynn was genuinely curious about this matter since it concerned his promotion. The uniqueness of the hermit pathway is indeed in the giant king's court. Saussure nodded, then showed an apologetic smile and said, "I'm sorry, but that uniqueness is in the hands of the giant king Ormir, and I couldn't bring it back for you." "No worries, that's not your fault." Lynn waved his hand dismissively. He wouldn't blame Saussure for not bringing back the hermit uniqueness for him, but he did stroke his chin thoughtfully. "The hermit uniqueness is with Ormir. I didn't notice that when I last saw him. He hasn't assimilated the hermit uniqueness." Saussure shook his head, explaining, probably to avoid becoming even more insane, Ormir is only using the hermit uniqueness as a tool, without assimilating it. Though ancient gods were insane, they weren't entirely devoid of reason. Otherwise, they wouldn't have removed non-adjacent characteristics through childbirth. So, even though Ormir had the hermit uniqueness, he hadn't chosen to assimilate it. After all, forcibly assimilating non-adjacent uniqueness, while it could enhance Ormir's combat power, would also drive him further into madness. Moreover, the increased combat power wouldn't reach a transformative level, making it not worth the risk. End of chapter. So it seems I woke up at just the right time. Lynn shook the wine glass in his hand, smiling as he spoke, though with some regret. It's a pity that I don't have the characteristics of the Knowledge Emperor. Even if I obtained the uniqueness, I wouldn't be able to use it right now. Although he had slept for 100 years, perhaps due to the active development of the Eye of Secrets during that time and the Sun God's Church's efforts to promote the name of the Angel of Secrets, Lynn's sage potion digestion had surprisingly progressed significantly. This might sound incredible, but considering how both Artisan and the Paragon potions were mostly advanced with the help of Russell, and how Klein managed to digest the Scholar of Your potion by relying on Amon feeding him knowledge in a short period of time, it's evident that the digestion of potions in the Beyonder world relies not only on the Beyonder's personal efforts but also heavily on external factors. So, although Lynn had been in slumber, the Eye of Secrets he created truly became a behemoth during this time, taking over the entire knowledge and education system of the Divine Kingdom. His identity as the Angel of Secrets became synonymous with a subordinate god of knowledge in the eyes of many followers. It's no surprise that Lynn could receive feedback from the Sage Potion under these circumstances. After receiving this wave of feedback, Lynn was only a step away from completely digesting the Sage Potion. Completing the digestion was now just a matter of time. As for the ritual to advance from Sage to Knowledge Emperor, it was a simple task for Lynn now. Advancing from Sage to Knowledge Emperor required mastering a sufficient amount of knowledge related to high-level existences. For example, knowledge about the Great Old Ones, secrets related to outer gods, or at the very least, gathering a significant amount of Sequence Zero knowledge. It's worth mentioning that mastering in this context doesn't just mean knowing some stories or truths about the Great Old Ones or Sequence Zero's that have been buried by time. It involves obtaining and analyzing the blood of several Sequence Zero's or in Great Old One, gaining a detailed understanding of their abilities. For an average Sequence 2 sage, this would certainly be a challenge. Not to mention how rare secret knowledge involving Sequence Zero or the Great Old Ones is. Not everyone has luck like Mr. Fool, with secrets piling up at their doorstep. For an ordinary sage who isn't closely affiliated with a Sequence Zero, it might be impossible to obtain the blood necessary to complete the ritual. Even if they are closely affiliated, getting the approval to simulate the abilities of a Sequence Zero is another hurdle. A Sequence 2 might seem powerful to ordinary people, but to a Sequence Zero, they're just an ant that can be severely injured with a mere glance. For those sages who are lucky enough to follow a Sequence Zero, they might be able to get their leader's help in obtaining the blood of other Sequence Zero's. But for wild sages, they might be stuck at the ritual stage for their entire life. However, for Lynn, this was not an issue. He knew a group of Sequence Zero's, and his knowledge of secrets was abundant. Just knowing the truth behind the destruction of the modern civilization was enough for a Sequence 2's advancement. As for the blood, that was even less of an issue. Lynn could ask the ancient sun god for a drop of his blood for analysis at any time. He could also get blood from the Evernight goddess and others. Moreover, when he defeated the giant King Ormir, he could collect blood from Ormir on the spot. So for Lynn, the only thing stopping him from advancing to Sequence 1 Knowledge Emperor was that he did not have the characteristics of the Knowledge Emperor. Ah, this is quite interesting. His first identity can advance but lacks characteristics, while the second identity has both the characteristics and uniqueness, but is still far from meeting the advancement conditions. Lynn mused internally, noticing Saussure with a subtle smile. Saussure said, "As for the characteristics of the Knowledge Emperor, perhaps you could ask Medici." Lynn paused, glancing at Medici, who was seated and pouring wine for Ouroboros. He was surprised. Medici has the characteristics of the Knowledge Emperor. Where did he get them? Saussure then showed a reminiscent expression, and after a few seconds, he said, "That was many years ago, during our intense battles with the elves. Medici encountered the elf god of knowledge on the battlefield and fought him alone." At this point, Saussure glanced at Medici again, who who was still pouring wine for Ouroboros, and commented with some emotion, "At that time, he was only a Sequence 1 conqueror." He then looked at Lynn and said, "Although he's always tough talking, I know that Medici actually cares about you." Saussure was well aware that during Lynn's slumber, aside from himself, the ones most eager for Lynn to awaken were Medici, Ouroboros, and Lynn's students. As for the others, including the main ones, Saussure knew they weren't particularly keen on Lynn waking up. After all, Lynn's slumber stabilized everyone's humanity and suppressed the madness and will of the great old ones. He was very useful. An awake Lynn was just a Sequence 2 sage, capable of being a Sequence 0 in critical moments. But a slumbering Lynn allowed them all to perform at 100% combat strength. Even those on the brink of losing control could recover and stabilize near Lynn. This essentially granted the ancient sun god faction a massive power boost. Because Lynn played such a crucial role during his slumber, the ancient sun god continued to support Lynn's Eye of Secrets during that time, allowing Lynn's loyal students to occupy key positions, just waiting for his awakening to seamlessly take over control of the Eye of Secrets once more. When it came to rewards and punishments, the ancient sun god was always fair. He preferred Lynn in slumber because his usefulness exceeded that of his awake state. However, he wouldn't overlook Lynn's contributions during his slumber. Especially since, although Lynn was asleep, beings like Medici and Ouroboros, who were close to the Angel of Secrets, remained awake. Upon hearing Saussure's words, Lynn paused for a moment. Almost reflexively, he turned to glance at the War Angel, his expression complex. He then set down his wine and walked over to Medici with a smile. "I heard someone prepared the characteristics of the Knowledge Emperor as a gift for me during my slumber. Where are they?" Medici paused in his act of pouring wine for the dumb snake. He glanced at his unashamed brother before curling his lips into a provocative smile, saying, "You want the characteristics of the Knowledge Emperor? Sure, beg me and I'll give them to you." Tisk tisk, as expected from a hunter with a mouth harder than bones. Lynn clicked his tongue, not surprised by Medici's words. If it were any other day, he might have responded with a counter-taunt or a smack to his stubborn brother, but today, feeling particularly good, he simply smiled and said, "Please." Lynn had no shame, so saying this word was easy for him. Medici was taken aback for a moment. He hadn't expected Lynn to beg so readily this time. He had already prepared to fight with his shameless brother. But after a brief moment of surprise, Medici's smile grew broader, becoming wild and unrestrained. He looked at Lynn and said, "All right, since you've begged, I'll be generous and give you the characteristics." End of chapter. If it were any other time and Lynn was met with such a sarcastic tone from Medici, he would have, at the very least, found another war angel from a different era to beat up, if not directly attacking the little redhead in front of him. He'd make sure Medici understood what it meant to have an older brother. But today, Lynn was in a good mood, so he forgave Medici's sharp tongue. After agreeing to retrieve the Knowledge Emperor's characteristic after the banquet, Lynn's gaze fell upon Ouroboros. Although Medici had made him drink a lot, the Angel of Fate, who had followed the ancient sun god the longest, showed no signs of inebriation. His face remained unchanged, just as it was before, with only a hint of alcohol lingering around him. "Good evening, Ouroboros." Lynn greeted him with a smile. After a few seconds of looking at Ouroboros, Lynn suddenly said, "Although it might be a bit late, congratulations on your promotion to Snake of Mercury." That's right, 100 years had passed. Not only had Medici been promoted to the King of Angels of the Hunter pathway, but Ouroboros had also made progress, rising to the position of Snake of Mercury. However, it seemed that he hadn't yet absorbed a second Sequence 1 characteristic, so he was still an ordinary Sequence 1 angel. "Thank you. And congratulations to you on your imminent promotion to Knowledge Emperor," Ouroboros replied earnestly, looking as stoic as ever. "Ha! What's there to congratulate him on? He'll be even dumber after the promotion." Medici scoffed, lifting his wine glass. Perhaps it was fate, or maybe it was Lynn's influence, but in the past 100 years, Medici and Ouroboros had almost become fixed partners, officially forming the Lord's Red and White Rose duo. Hearing this, Lynn glanced at Medici and then smiled. Slowly, he picked up a nearby empty wine glass, filled it, and raised it toward Medici, saying with a grin, "Of course, we also need to congratulate our dear little redhead for officially becoming a war angel. Truly impressive." His tone was a blend of sincerity and the playful tone one would use with a child. "Are you teasing a child?" Medici paused mid-drink, glancing at Lynn with disdain. "Then again, you were only 3 years old when you fell asleep, so I suppose you still are a child." Lynn didn't get angry. He simply swirled his wine glass and, with a smile, said, "So, is our big kid, Little Red, ready to accept the blessings from his 3-year-old brother?" "Humph." Medici let out a disdainful snort. The next moment, the two glasses clinked together with such force that some of the wine spilled. Medici didn't mind at all, downing his drink in one gulp. He then gestured toward his empty glass and provocatively looked at Lynn, saying, "A certain 3-year-old brother wouldn't happen to not know how to drink, would he?" Lynn gave him a look and downed his glass as well. "Another round." Medici lifted a nearby wine barrel, his smile full of challenge. "Sure." Lynn nodded nonchalantly. He didn't particularly enjoy drinking, but if he had to, he could handle it. However. But just drinking is boring. "How about we play a game?" Lynn suggested with a grin. "What game?" The war angel, of course, wouldn't back down at such a moment and asked directly. "Truth or dare?" Lynn introduced the rules with a smile. The game was pretty much the same as usual, except for an option to replace truth or dare with a drink as a penalty. After explaining the rules, Lynn turned to Ouroboros and said, "Why don't you join us, Ouroboros? The more, the merrier." "All right." Ouroboros nodded, having no objections. Thus, when Saussure made his rounds at the banquet, he suddenly saw Medici, who had been sitting just moments ago, sneaking up behind Akases. As a lover of fine wine, Akases had been drinking heavily since the banquet began. Now, he was half drunk, and since he hadn't yet received the characteristic from the ancient sun god, he was still a sequence too. In a gathering filled with allies, he had no sense of caution and thus failed to notice Medici sneaking up behind him. Then, to Saussure's bewilderment, Medici, hiding behind Akases, snapped his fingers. A small, hand-sized firebird appeared in the air and promptly crashed into Akases's hair. Ah! Naturally, Akases was startled by this sudden attack. He jumped up from his seat and quickly extinguished the flames in his hair, only to find the tips of his hair singed and blackened, with several other parts scorched. "Saussure. What's going on?" Saussure didn't understand. And neither did Akases, who, having sobered up somewhat, frowned at Medici and said in his usual calm tone, "I don't recall offending you recently. It was just a small joke, Akases. You don't mind, do you?" Medici clapped his hands, laughing with wild abandon. He glanced at Akases and added meaningfully, "After all, Akases, you're always one for harmless pranks. I thought you'd appreciate such mischief." "Of course, I don't mind." Akases, clearly taken aback, forced a smile. Hearing Medici's words, Saussure paused, and then he understood what Medici was referring to. It had happened about 6 months ago. After a major battle, they were all stabilizing themselves around Lynn when Akases, either intentionally or unintentionally, remarked, "It'd be nice if Lynn stayed asleep forever." The comment immediately made Medici's face darken, but Akases brushed it off as just a joke. Saussure had mediated the conflict between them at the time, but clearly, the war angel hadn't forgotten, leading to today's small act of revenge. "I'm glad you don't mind," Medici said, turning on his heel and heading back to his seat. He and Akases had never gotten along well, so he had no intention of giving him much face. "How did my dare turn out?" Medici asked with a smile as he sat back down. Indeed, Medici had set Akases's hair on fire not just for the past grudge, but also because he had to complete his dare, to scare one random angel at the banquet. "I thought you were going to burn him bald," Lynn quipped, taking his eyes off Akases. As someone capable of reading minds, Lynn could easily see the simmering anger beneath Akases's forced smile. So he offered a reminder, "But you might want to be careful in the future." Lynn wasn't particularly concerned about Medici burning Akases's hair. After all, in another timeline, they had been enemies. Akases was a confirmed traitor, and Lynn wouldn't have minded even if Medici had beaten him up instead of just burning his hair. End of chapter.